Jessica Fraser. I'm a lecturer at the University of Oxford.
Well, I'm Alistair McGrath and I'm the Andreas Idris Professor of Science and Religion.
I am Professor Dermot McCullough and my speciality is the history of the Church.
My name's Catherine. They call me an Associate Professor of Old Testament.
My name is Anthony Reddy. I'm the Director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture.
My name is Hindy Najman. I'm the Royal Online Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture.
I'm Anna Sapir Abulafia, and here in Oxford I hold the chair of the study of the Abrahamic religions.
So many different situations around the world at the moment, if you look at the news, are about groups of people who don't really understand each other and sometimes don't want to understand each other. We can see this in major political conflicts in different countries in the Middle East or in the West. It relates to migrant crisis issues, it relates to political oppositions, it relates to the rise of prejudicial nationalisms that have a problem with one group. There's just so many different conflicts that it speaks to. And what I always hope is that the person who studies religion is the person who learns that you always need to understand the other person's point of view before you can even start to make a judgment or decide on where you stand yourself. In many cases in the past, when there was something in the headlines that was generating debate and conflict and prejudices, it was the people who had to study other religions that knew to stand back, see what the other person actually thought and was motivated by, and even then, whilst following their own beliefs, could engage in a much more intelligent way, right? And actually be much more effective. So I think that studying cultures and theologies different from our own not only gives us more ways of thinking, but also allows us to just do better in all our communications with other groups. Whether in our personal life, when you're at the pub and you're trying to make sense of someone you don't quite get, or whether you're in your political life and trying to make major decisions, both of them it's really important.
I think there is always a risk that we become very settled, very locked within our own way of thinking, very impervious to alternative ways of thinking. And if I can put it like this, I feel that, it's like Plato, an unexamined life isn't really worth living. If you have a set of beliefs, if you can't defend them against alternatives, well, what's the point? And so I think it's very important for people to be confronted with ideas that are not theirs and ask, how do you respond to these? If they are wrong, please show so. But actually, you might learn from this as well. So therefore, for me, dialogue with people who take different positions to me is a way in which I grow and a way in which I learn. I don't feel it threatening. In my own career, I've had some very significant arguments with people like Richard Dawkins and others like that. And in part, I've seen that as being very important to show that theology is actually a defensible intellectual undertaking. But also, in responding to Richard Dawkins, I do often find myself thinking, I haven't thought that through yet, and engaging him makes me think this through. In other words, very often engaging with an alternative or even an opposing position helps you to think things through for yourself. Very often, the internal stimulus isn't good enough. That's something from outside saying, here's something else. How do you respond to that? And that can be very, very helpful. But I must emphasize that in responding to people with whom I differ, I think it's extremely important to be gracious, to be winsome, to be kind of way gracious about this, because, other people have views which need to be taken seriously as well. I know what mine are, and I love dialogues, but I do try to treat it as a respectful conversation rather than, if you like, a very aggressive argument.
It seems to me that you can't understand yourself if you don't understand others. You can't understand your subject if you don't see the things around it. So for those of us who are seized by enthusiasm for study, it's absolutely necessary to get beyond our own religious experience, if it is a religious experience. Or for those who don't have a religious experience, to look at those who do around them. Comparison, contrast is is what we do as human beings, particularly Enlightenment human beings. It seems to me the great contribution of the 17th, 18th century Enlightenment to human experience was the ability to stand back from oneself. Human beings have usually been pretty good at standing back from other people and assessing them, but the distinctive contribution of the Western Enlightenment has been to apply that to us, ourselves, and say, well, how does my view of the world look if I stand outside it? And if I apply the same sort of criteria as I might to Aztec religion or Hinduism as a Christian, then I'm doing something very healthy. It is that ancient maxim, know thyself, nosce te ipsum, should be the motto of any academic in any discipline, but particularly the religious one.
I've got a book, an edited volume coming up on the Psalms and the use of the critical imagination. And I think it's actually, it engages the imagination, and I'm not just thinking sort of like, imaginary as in kind of airy fairy. I'm thinking actually it's an important critical tool to open up texts. And I think the other thing that's absolutely essential in studying religion and cultures other than our own is critical empathy, or even radical empathy. That when you're looking at these things, you are forming understanding of another. And often, the texts that I study, I need dead languages for them. And essentially I'm studying, the fragments, the remnants of people who've died before me. And why bother to do that? It doesn't affect my, but I think it is important to do that, because in developing a kind of radical, critical empathy, it pushes you towards a recognition and an acknowledgement and an understanding of the other. And even if, it's hard to understand some of the things that come into the texts that you engage with, even if, practices are difficult to, and a lot of the stuff that emerges in the biblical text, I just think, whoa, that's a problem. But I think you can't change anything unless you first really genuinely attempt to understand it. And so, that's, I think, the critical imagination and critical empathy are the two key things I think that you get from a degree in theology and religion, or from studying theology and religion.
I think fundamentally it's about empathy. That when we understand the way in which other religions function and how they have operated within society and how they shape human personality and human living, that all of us live it in a context, no human being or no community sort of lives in a bubble that's isolated from influences that are around them and are not shaped by history. And so for me, I think the importance of understanding other religious traditions other than our own is that it gives us an insight into their values, their meaning-making processes, the things that are important to them, which then hopefully opens us up to an understanding of those who are other, more than just the presumption of ourselves and what we think is normative and what we think actually should be the case. And as I said, I think the biggest gift I genuinely believe I've had has been living in a very plural society when I was young. So for me, being amongst people with different religious traditions has never been anything other than normal, because that was normal, if you're in a primary school and your best friend his parents are Polish and they're Catholic on the one hand, and then your next best friend is Sikh, whose parents come from the Punjab, but all of you have got a Bradford accent. And all of you are growing up in Bradford. What it also does as well is it's a way of relativizing the otherness. And what I mean by that is that we tend to do one of two things when we think of people who are not like us. We either try to make them like us, and so if I had £1 for every time someone has said, but Anthony, I don't see you as black, like you're just like me, And it's like, well, firstly, there's a huge arrogance that says I should be like you for you to feel okay, because actually, why can't I just be me? So on the one hand, it's an attempt to try and lessen what is distinctive about other people in order to make them an extension of ourselves, which is partly psychological, that the more someone is like you, the less of a threat they appear to be. But also, if we've been honest, it's a product of colonialism and empire. The empires are about reproducing people in faraway places and to make them just like those at the centre of the power. So, so British missionaries go from London and they go to faraway places. And it's not just that they want to make people Christians, they want to make them a certain type of English Christian. So one of the things I still remember it's partly jokey, but it is partly kind of ridiculous, is being in a very traditional Anglican service in the middle of Barbados, which is a Caribbean island part of the British Empire. And it's Christmas time, and it's 90 degrees in the shade. And all the priests are wearing all the fineries that a Anglo-Catholic priest would wear, let's say here in Oxford. Which makes sense when you're in Oxford in December, because it's cold. But this is kind of Barbados, so it's 90 degrees in the shade. The priests are sweating like a pig, so they literally got ushers walking next to them, trying to fan them down. And then we get to the liturgy, and then we sing In the Deep Midwinter. And it's like, what, the deep where? Barbados? That's all colonialism, okay? That's which they've internalized. So even though they've been independent since 1966, they still do it because that's what proper Anglicanism looks like. So on the one hand, it's a temptation to turn the other into us. The other extreme is to make the other so exotic that they have nothing to do with us and they're just weird. So it's like, it's those weird people over there who do that weird stuff that they do, oh my God, And both are problematic. Now, when you study other people's religion and you get to understand it, you see that in some regards we're more alike than unalike. But also you get to put that into its perspective, that just as Christianity has a wide variety of the way in which it's practiced, for some people will be very fundamentalist and they try to live by the Ten Commandments and it informs everything they do, to other people who would say, well, I'm a Christian, but it's only one facet of my life, actually. I'm really into politics, I'm into sport, whatever. This religious thing is just a little box in the corner. Well, actually, other religious traditions function exactly the same way. There's a long continuum between those people who would be, at worst, fanatics, and the others who would say, well, actually, culturally, this is my heritage, but really it plays no great part in how I live. I learned that instinctively actually just growing up within Bradford and seeing that amongst my friends who were religious, their religion was as complicated as mine was. So there are some Muslims who were quite devout, and I had other Muslim friends who would have a bacon sandwich on the side and say, yeah, well, I'll eat some Polas on the way home and my parents won't know the difference. Well, actually, that's how Christians operate. That's how people in all religious traditions operate. So what it does is, it helps us to have a nuanced understanding of how we see people. We don't essentialize them into boxes as kind of exotics on the one hand, but we don't try to interpret their experience and to domesticate it, to make them like us in another. It actually says that all of us are complex and all of us are diverse, and religion helps us to understand the nature of how that diversity gets played out.
I believe deeply in what I've called a comparative ethic or a comparative mode of thinking. In order to understand commentary, for example, I think we don't only understand in the history of the Hebrew Bible or Jewish interpretation. There's a lot of interpretation embedded in the Hebrew Bible. Already Daniel's reading Jeremiah, and Psalm 104 is rereading creation, and there's so many more examples. Jeremiah 36 is rereading the end of 2 Kings 2. We can continue to talk about the history of interpretation. We see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Hellenistic Jewish texts in the New Testament, in patristic scholars, in rabbinic scholars. But I don't really think we can properly understand reading practices and techniques of reading without looking to otherness. So I've strongly encouraged practices of reading, in Akkadian materials, in Persian period, in Hellenistic period, but we continue, and I continue, to understand the history of literary method and theory as modes of reading and thinking. So we're both, I'm answering this question both with respect to the history of interpretation, to understand learning from otherness, even practices that are not at all religious or self-consciously theological, but also, and this is a very deep and important part of the way I think, to look not necessarily traditions that touched our own traditions, like the Greco-Roman world touched the history of Judaism and early Christianity, but also to think about traditions of Sanskrit, to think about traditions of Islam that are later than the traditions I'm talking about, but nevertheless to understand the other, by which I mean the other tradition, a different set of beliefs, different practices, or shared interpretive practices. I use the example of interpretation, but I have many other examples that we could put on the table here to think about it. So I think that comparison is also theological and also religious. Some people say, well, comparative religions, that's the religion part of the faculty. I think whatever we do, we need to think in a way that is humble, that we're one person or one community or one tradition among many traditions. And this is the way to refine and crystallize our own understanding. What I'm not saying is the only way to be a theologian is to do it in dialogue. I'm not saying that. It can be enormously productive to be in conversation with otherness. But I think to only work in your tradition, you run the risk of becoming triumphalist and of not understanding properly the nature of critique that I spoke of earlier, that one needs to be critical of oneself, of one's expectations. And this, I mentioned my students earlier. I have 2 children, and they never stop. I mean, they're no longer children. They're 20 and 22. But each of them, in their own way, is constantly challenging me to critique myself, my practice, my thinking. And I think to look from the outside, part of what I mean is that one always needs someone on the outside to keep us honest. And we can also be that outside for our conversation partners.
That's my life's work, really. I mean, my training, I'm a medieval historian of Latin Christendom, and my whole work's been really focused on approaching the medieval past in a way that isn't just Christocentric. If you open up your mind to things that are not Christian, you learn so much more. I mean, I know that from teaching medieval history when I was teaching that in Cambridge. And so often, I taught political thought there, and it was really quite often difficult to get students to understand the difference between spiritual power and temporal power and why the two were enmeshed and all that sort of thing. But if you then just said to them, well, okay, but you know, there you have a pope like Gregory VII, and so we're Gregorian reform, so the second half of the 11th century. And he uses pretty much the same word for society and church, ecclesia, societas. Well, there's maybe something wonderful there from a Christian point of view, but just ask yourself, where do Jews and Muslims fit into that? They don't. And then you can start really talking and thinking, okay, so where were the others? How are Christians? Because they knew about Jews. They knew about Muslims. Of course they did. Think about Al-Andalus. Think about Muslim Spain. Think about the Jewish communities in Europe. How do they think about the other? My own work is, I'm working on ecclesiastical law at the moment. How it actually was taught in Cambridge by the earliest masters here of the university. Why does that law even mention Jews? It does. What's going on? How did the masters teaching this material think about it? You learn so much about Christianity itself. You learn more about Christianity when you ask these questions than you learn about Judaism, because it is very much the questions asked from a Christian perspective, but you learn much, much more about it. And similar when you look at Hebrew sources and you see how Hebrew sources in this part of the world react towards the Christian society. You learn huge amounts about that. And I think that is true for all traditions. So again, what I think is great in our faculty, that students have the possibility to take papers that will allow them to look at more than one tradition. And we really are a faculty of theology and religion. This is not just a Christian divinity faculty. There are many more possibilities, and I think that's a very good thing.